Thanks for the privilege of your time. This is the Salvant report. Iran did not start its war with the US and Israel, but more than a month in, the Islamic Republic is clearly winning it. American and Israeli forces have spent weeks incessantly bombing Iranian territory, killing thousands of people and damaging hundreds of buildings, all in hopes of toppling the country's government. Yet, Iran has held the line and successfully defending its interests. He has maintained continuity of leadership even as his top officials have been assassinated, and he has repeatedly hit back at his aggressors even as they strike at its military, civilian, and industrial facilities. The Americans and the Israelis, who started the conflict with delusions of forcing capitulation, thus find themselves in a quagmire without an exit strategy. The Iranians, by contrast, have pulled off a historic feat of resistance. To some Iranians, this success is reason to continue fighting until the aggressors are adequately punished rather than to search for a negotiated ending. Every night since February 28th, large crowds of proud Iranians have gathered across the country to show their defiance by shouting, "No capitulation, no compromise, fight with America." After all, the US has proved that it cannot be trusted in talks and that it will not respect Iran's sovereignty. By this logic, there is no reason to engage with the country now and offer it an off ramp. Instead, according to most Iranians, Tehran should press its advantage, continuing to strike US bases and blocking commerce in the Strait of Hormuz until Washington fundamentally alters its regional presence and posture. Within days of the initial US and Israeli attack on Iran on February 28, 2026, the world was plunged into an energy crisis. That's what, of all the things going on right now, we are thinking and talking about the future economic consequences of that war. Within days, we already plunged into an energy crisis. That's the first crisis. Tehran's near shuttering of the Strait of Hormuz, through which roughly 20% of the world's oil and liquefied natural gas transit each day, amounted to the largest disruptions of global energy flows in history. And this is according to the International Energy Agencies. An international energy agency that was funded in 1974 after the 1973 energy crisis. We will come to that. Within the first 3 weeks of the conflict, oil prices rose by 55%. Gasoline jumped by roughly $1 a gallon, and heating oil and jet fuel soared even higher. Many countries began to ration fuel, shorten work weeks, and close factories. They were forced to ration that. It quickly became clear that until the Strait of Hormuz reopened, prices will continue to climb, boosting inflation and dampening growth. This crisis may appear to be unprecedented, but its contours are familiar. In 1973, Arab members of OPEC embargoed oil export to countries supporting Israel in the Arab-Israeli war, causing a dramatic price spike that traumatized American consumers and contributed to high inflation and slow growth. Always, it's Israel, the Arab members of the OPEC, the embargoed oil exports. The 1973 crisis also inspired effort to avoid another shock. And here we are with the Iran shock. Government took steps to reduce their reliance on imports, build strategic stocks, and pursue greater cooperation and market integration. Over time, policymakers grew more comfortable trusting their country's energy security to global markets. And yet, the world never escaped the reality of all geopolitics. Analysts and officials had warned for decades. They have warned for decades that the Strait of Hormuz was vulnerable. Its closure has been the crisis scenarios that everyone most feared. Analysts and officials have warned for 3, 4, or 5 decades that the Strait of Hormuz was vulnerable, and nobody did anything. Yet, the relative ease and speed with which the entire global economy could be put in jeopardy seem to come as something of a surprise. What we are living, what now? However, since after 1973, analysts and officials have warned about for decades that the Strait of Hormuz was vulnerable. Not one, not three, not four, not five, almost 6 or 7 decades. Even though Iran was badly outmatched militarily by the US and Israel, he managed to exert effective control over shipping through the strait. Iran is in charge, what now, while we are speaking, of the Strait of Hormuz. That alone was enough to cause economic turmoil and subsequent Iranian and Israeli strikes on other key energy installations in the region only exacerbated the crisis. In late March, both Israel and Iran attacked gas fields in the Persian Gulf, the most dramatic escalation yet in the Iran War. By striking upstream energy infrastructure, the belligerents have ensured that the war will have global ramifications lasting beyond the end of the conflict. Even if the recently announced ceasefire holds and the war ends soon, it could take up to 5 years to rebuild the infrastructure that was lost. And if the ceasefire fails and the war continues, so too does the risk of even further destruction. In a world of finite resources, it will be the wealthiest that can afford to pay premium prices for the energy that remains. And it will be the world's poorest who suffer most. In a world of finite resources, it will be the wealthiest that can afford to pay premium prices for the energy that remains. And it will be the world's poorest who suffer most. Indeed, these strikes, along with the broader energy sector disruption that have accompanied the US-Israeli war in Iran, have all but guaranteed an energy supply shock that or that will drive up inflation globally. Additional strikes on infrastructures that is critical to energy production and distribution will also exacerbate such a crisis. The energy crisis that we're living now was since 1973. And this dynamic excess demand for limited resources is a classic driver of inflation. Almost immediately after the strikes, U.S. market began betting that the U.S. Federal Reserve will increase interest rates, its most direct tool for fighting inflation. Amid an already challenging cost of living crisis, the American people will suffer consequences of that war, of that energy crisis. Rate hikes will affect borrowing costs on expenses such as car loans and mortgages. Increased energy prices will drive up the price of gas and other fuels, which we are experiencing now as I speak. And manufacturers of the myriad goods on which people rely will pass higher production costs on to consumers. Regardless of the outcome of this war, it is already clear that many countries will have to pay more for the energy needed to fuel their industries, power their electric grids, and sustain their transportation network. They will. This is the hidden costs of the war that going on what now. And it will befall hardest on those least able to bear it. It will fall hardest on those least able to bear it. We, the poor people. In fact, many low-income countries are already struggling with historic level of sovereign debt. In recent years, the share of countries in debt distress has more than doubled, from 24% in 2013 to 54% in 2024. The share of countries in debt distress has more than doubled. As the geopolitical climate becomes more fraught, massive default among developing countries could reverse gain in poverty eradication, global health, and industrialization, creating hardship that all disproportionately on children that fall disproportionately on children and the elderly. Energy crisis, death crisis, low-income countries will struggle with historic level of sovereign debt. Energy crisis that we are living now, the first consequence of that stupid war, a war of choice. The second is going to be sovereign debt. How many countries are going to file bankruptcy? We don't know. However, developing countries have been through this kind of debt crisis before. During the Yom Kippur War in 1973, the Organization of Petroleum Exporting Countries, OPEC, banned the export of oil to countries that supported Israel. It's always Israel. The resulting supply shock caused global energy prices to surge by 300% in 6 months, affecting manufacturing, transportation, and household costs across the world. That was the result of that crisis. For a time, many countries hoped they could escape the turbulence of all politics. And after the crisis of the 1970s that we just talked about, major importers moved to reduce oil demand and better prepare for disruption. They replaced oil with coal and nuclear power in electricity generation, built strategic reserves, improve the quality of energy data, remove price controls, and created what we talked about a while ago, the International Energy Agency in 1974, in order for them to coordinate responses to crisis. And that's the reason this international agency had released 400 million barrels of oil, 400 million barrels of oil in order to help with this crisis, because through the Strait of Hormuz, more than 20 million barrels of oil transit every day, and now it's almost closed. After, let's see, 43 or 44 days. 44 days. So the only thing that the International Energy Agencies founded in 1974 to help to coordinate this kind of crisis. He said that was the worst since then. And he has released 400 million barrels of oil. That's good. The US in particular came to believe, the US in particular came to believe it will overcome its oil energy vulnerabilities. 2 decades ago, the country imported roughly 60% of its oil. President George W. Bush warned in 2006, 20 years ago, as his predecessors had before him, that America is addicted to oil. And he urged the country to make its reliance on Middle Eastern supplies a thing of the past. As recently as last December, the American administration National Security Strategy, the document that they put out in December, declared that as U.S. oil productions increases, America's historic reason for focusing on the Middle East will recede. Not quiet. U.S. with Israel just attacked Iran, which with that created the first energy crisis since 1973. And the other consequence that we're talking to you about right now will be a debt crisis. You got to watch how many low-income countries, how many countries that are going to say, hey, I cannot pay myself my foreign debt. I don't have enough. And the U.S. with its national debt, $39 trillion, is paying close to $2 billion every day as interest on that debt. As the countries after 1973, including the US, so they're not supposed to be addicted to oil and stay away from the Middle Eastern supply, the signing of the Paris Climate Agreement in 2015 had further, beyond expectation, around the world that the geopolitics of oil and gas might fade with the clean energy transition. Leaders in the US and Europe argued that moving quickly to replace fossil fuels with renewables will not only help them meet their pledges to cut carbon emission, but also serve another purpose. By reducing their dependence on foreign fuels, countries could expand their freedom of action in foreign policies. For the United States, the crisis right now, the energy crisis, has underscored that energy superpower status doesn't eliminate vulnerability to geopolitical upheaval. The disruptions of to Middle Eastern supplies is just the latest example of a of a growing trend of energy weaponization. Because it's not just oil and gas flows that are at risk. China's dominance in the emerging clean energy economy gives Beijing plenty of levers to pull. And as great power rivalry intensifies and the international economic order fragments, countries are increasingly willing to exploit the dependence of others on global energy markets using sanctions, export control, cyber attacks, and maritime pressure to advance foreign policy objectives. These tactics were on full display in the first 3 months of 2026 alone, and not just in the Gulf. When the American administration eased sanctions on Venezuela oil in March, after the kidnapping of the president Maduro, the waiver explicitly excluded transactions involving the U.S. chief geopolitical rivals China and Russia among other adversaries. 2. Crisis. Because of this war of choice. Some people said because of this stupid war, a war that wasn't supposed to be fought. First energy crisis, then foreign debt crisis. Of the $475 billion in outstanding bilateral debts owed by low and middle income countries today, Chinese loans account for the largest portion at just over $147.5 billion, or roughly 31%. Listen to that. $475 billion in outstanding bilateral debts owed by low and middle income countries. And they will find themselves with the inability to pay back these loans. And all these of the war. Two consequences of the war. Energy crisis that we're living right now, and also debt crisis coming up. Although debt sustainability has been a growing issue for at least 5 years, the war in Iran has introduced the kind of sudden global economic shock that make it all but certain that a prolonged debt crisis is coming. I warn you. A prolonged debt crisis is coming. Now we're leaving the energy crisis. The debt crisis is on its way. It will take years for some of the damaged oil and gas fields to resume operation. And although the ceasefire may ease shipping tensions in the short term, there remains no permanent resolution to the US-Iranian standoff over access to the Strait of Hormuz. In the meantime, inflation is likely to rise, increasing pressure on the Federal Reserve in the US to raise interest rates. The poorest countries will then suffer most as their governments are forced to restructure budgets to meet interest obligation rather than invest in their own economic growth and their population. Although some lesson from the previous major debt crisis can be applied to the current one, the more complex nature of today's debt is likely to extend the crisis and introduce new challenges, including the question of burden sharing across bondholders and Chinese bank. But this war, horrible as it is, has opened the door for a doable settlement. Iranians may be outraged, but they cannot push forward knowing that they stood tall in the face of a massive and illegal military onslaught by two nuclear armed powers. US officials may still dislike the Islamic Republic, but they now realize that the government isn't going anywhere and that they will have to live alongside this republic. Emotion may be high, and each side is boasting about its warfront victories. But history best remembers those who made peace. Thank you for your time. That was the Salvant report. Until next week.